Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitInWriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
We are live from Synthplex 2022 in Burbank, California. My guest is Drew Schlesinger, and I'm really glad that I was able to pronounce that well.
People have a lot of trouble with that.
It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Drew is, among other things, a programmer and a synthesist, which is another word I love saying. Let's get a little bit into your history first, because you go back to kind of almost the prehistoric age of synthesis, don't you?
Yes, it was the early years. Well, where do you want me to start?
Actually, I want you to start with a little bit of background on yourself. Musical background, technical background.
Sure, I can. The first thing I became was an organist, seeing The Doors on Ed Sullivan. Ray Manzarek. And I said to my parents, I want to do that.
I want a B3.
Gosh, a B3 was like unobtainium.
Mm-hmm.
My first organ was an RMI Lark, an orange RMI Lark. And then I got a Gibson 101, which was what Ray used in The Doors besides his Farfisa. I took organ lessons and I learned chords, but I'm basically a self-taught musician.
But emphasis here on organ, not on keyboards or piano.
No keyboards, no music theory, no piano. There was never a piano in our house. My brother played guitar.
But you weren't looking for like Rachmaninoff. You were looking for Manzarek.
No, nobody listened to classical music in our house. The music that was coming from our house was what my brother was bringing home, the records he was buying.
Okay.
And he was pretty hip.
Okay.
So he was really on the cutting edge. I mean, he saw Hendrix.
I had an older stepbrother too. I understand.
So, and my ear was starting to get tuned to what was happening, and then, while I heard Wendy Carlos's "Switched on Bach," I was like, "That's really interesting," but I don't really like Bach. So, I know it was a transformational album for a lot of people. For me, it was probably hearing Keith Emerson's first Emerson, Lake and Palmer album, and Lucky Man.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think.
For me, it was actually, I think the first synthesizer I heard was on "Here Comes the Sun."
Yeah.
And where that kicks in, I just remember, even at a younger age, I was just like, "What the hell is that?"
And it's really mixed in there in such an articulate way that it doesn't stand out.
Right.
This is heretical, but I wasn't a real big Beatles fan.
Oh,
We're
done.
My musical taste started later. And what really knocked my socks off was when I heard Morton Subotnick. And then I was like, what is that?
Yeah,
and that's when I really started becoming interested in synthesizers. And then, yes, I was really into progressive rock, English rock, the first Roxy Music album, that's around 71.
Yeah.
69, 70, 71 was when I really started to say, what is that? And that really interests me. And then all I ever did was buy records that had synthesizers on it. If it had synthesizer on it, I'd buy it.
Well, that was a hell of an era, though.
Yeah. And there was so much interesting sounds being done because people didn't know what they were. It was explorational, right? They were just figuring it out themselves.
Yeah.
And then you had people like Jan Hammer, who took it to another level from playing. But for me, I think Emerson, Lake and Palmer, yes, Genesis, and then I started listening to all the English bands like Gong and Tim Blake, who would make all these EMS noises, and Eno was using an EMS, and that's when I was like, that's the sound that really I love, and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Sure.
And I fell in love with the EMS synth before I even knew really what it was. I mean, I saw VCS3, 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 and I'm like, the sounds I hear coming from that machine, if I could have one of those, I would be really a happy guy. A lot of people wanted a Mini Moog, which I loved as well, but
I did too, but you know, they were unaffordable.
Unaffordable. And actually, my first synthesizer was a Micro Moog.
Mine was a Pro 1 for the same reason. It was lower priced than a Mini Moog.
Yes. And then I went to the Boston School of Electronic Music for a summer semester when I was in college. And I learned from a guy named Jim Mitchmerhausen, who wrote the original ARP 2600 owner's manual. And it was the coolest place on earth.
I'll bet.
It was an apartment on Dartmouth Street, like a 4-bedroom apartment, and all it was filled with gear. Oberheim 8-voice, Polymoogs, Mini Moogs, Moog modulars.
I know people like that.
These days you look on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook, you see people with like tons of gear.
Yeah.
But at that time, it was really the only place you could go. Universities had some Buchla gear, but these were a bunch of hip people teaching the art of analog synthesis. They taught me the fundamentals, and then I went home and then I bought an Oberheim expander module and I pulled out all the patch points and I hooked that up to the Micro Moog, and then from then on it was just
created a monster.
A monster. You know, I was hooked, and all the free money and all the free time went into synthesizers.
And what about from a technical perspective?
Meaning from understanding how they worked electronically?
Well, you know, obviously there was a musical motivation here, but clearly there was also a technical motivation. I mean, people don't just get into synths. Well, in that particular era, people didn't just get into synthesizers. They got into synthesizers and they got deep into the left brain aspect of it, creating patches and
it was a combination of both. I was looking for sounds, and I was inspired by a lot of what I heard on records, and I was trying to recreate it. So between the Micro Moog and the Oberheim expander module, and then I did some work with a guy named David Torn, who's now famous.
Yeah.
He had bought an Avatar.
Oh.
And I had this 4-track studio, and we hooked the Avatar up to the Moog and the Oberheim, and we just got this monstrous sound. And he's an incredible player, and his articulation is so great that he could actually make the thing, the Avatar, track, and it was notorious for being horrendous to play, but he's such a talented player, and we recorded a whole album's worth of music just not with any intention, which sat in my basement for 40 years, and we released it about 3 years ago.
Well, good things take time.
Yeah. It sat, and then I called him up one day. I said, can you listen to this music and tell me whether you think it's any good? And he said it was.
So, did you have the original 4 tracks? And was this
I had the original 4 tracks, but I finally got myself a decent 4-track machine, and that took years to find. That worked, and I had all the tapes. I transferred them all into my computer. So I had all the original tapes transferred, could play them once, maybe twice.
Right.
They just started shredding,
of course,
as you would expect. But got some really good quality transfers.
Cool.
And they sat in my computer for a long time after I had transferred them. And then, again, I started listening to them. And then did some songwriting in the 80s, doing some synth pop work. That didn't really go anywhere. And then around 86, the DX7 came out, and then the CZ101, and I was immediately attracted to the CZ101.
Yeah, and that's when MIDI started becoming a reality and
almost usable
and all that, yeah.
And I listened to the CZ1, I had a DX7 and the CZ101, and I couldn't really get into FM. I found it obtuse. And the CZ101, I had just a sense that there was something more there. And I started programming sounds. And I put them on patch sheets, and I went down to Manny's Music on 48th Street, and I said, who runs your keyboard department? And there was a guy named Rick Stevenson who has subsequently passed, but he was really hip and knew everything about all the synthesizers that were coming out and all the keyboards. And I gave him a set. He listened to them. He liked them. They bought them. They started selling them. All of a sudden, I was in business selling third-party sounds.
That's kind of unexpected, huh?
It was totally unexpected. And then a company came out with these Easy CZ cartridges, which were these big square cartridges, but they had 4 banks with 16 sounds. And I put out 3 of them. I started selling those. Casio heard them. Jerry Kowarski at Casio actually went to Manny's, and Rick refused to give him the sounds or even sell them to him. He says, "You're just going to steal them, and I'm not going to let you take advantage of this guy." So Jerry gave him his card, said, "Have him contact me." Contacted him. He really liked the sounds.
And Jerry is a very straight up guy, by the way.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
He pulls no punches. He doesn't like something, he wouldn't have asked. Next thing I know, I was showing at a NAMM show in Chicago. And from there, it just kind of took off. I made a couple of other products. I kept going to the NAMM shows. Then I wrote the CZ1, the user's guide to I wrote the insider's guide to the Casio CZ synthesizers. Alfred Publishing asked me to write a book. I had never written a book. I said, sure, why not? Did it. And then I had some credentials, and I started going to the shows and going to the different manufacturers and saying, I'm a sound programmer for hire. And there weren't that many at the time.
Right.
And there weren't that many synthesizer companies. I mean, you had Korg and you had Roland. You had Kurzweil hadn't come out with the K2000 yet.
Right.
So, and I started making sounds.
I see a recurring theme here, though, which is, sure, why not?
Kind of. It was. I didn't think that I would have a career as a sound designer for 16 years. It wasn't like I looked at that trajectory, but I was certainly smitten with all the gear, and I loved it, you know. And I was like, well, gee, not only will I make some sounds and make some money and actually make a living, I'll get to try all these things.
Yeah.
And boxes would come to my house, and I'd have them for a while, and I'd program sounds, send them back. Another box would come.
Yeah. And if you really like something, you can offer to keep it, right?
I worked out a deal with the manufacturer. I said, you know, I'll do the X number of sounds. It's worth X number of dollars, and if I could afford it, and I would keep the instrument. So I had, after a while, I had a nice little collection of devices that I really liked.
I was going to ask if you at that point became more or less an obsessive collector. Or...
I never did.
No?
I always focused on a few instruments at a time. The Wave Station, the K2000, the CZ actually to this day.
Good choices. Yeah.
Between the Casio, the CZ101 and the CZ1, the Wave Station, Kurzweil, K2000, and then the 2500. But I wanted to become a virtuoso at fewer instruments than have a lot of instruments. And I really wanted to understand them intimately because I knew I wanted to make my own sounds. And I wanted sounds that sounded like me. So I would make sounds for sale and give them to the companies, but I would also be making sounds for myself.
So you'd be programming one particular sound and say, ooh, I'm keeping that one. That's mine.
Sometimes, yes.
They
would, and a lot of times they were less commercial.
Well, it depends on what you're doing with them, right?
In my mind, for the kind of music that I wanted to make, I said, this is something that'll work for me, but after you do it a while for the companies, you get a sense of what they're looking for.
Sure.
It needed to be, they wanted sounds that were interesting and musically useful.
Yes, exactly. And usually that means it sounds like something.
It sounds like something.
Emulating something, Is it strings? Is it horns? Is it something that is usable from that perspective? I think
it fills a musical niche that people will understand.
Right.
They won't listen to it and say, "Gee, that's really weird." I don't know where I'm going to use that.
Well, as an example, when the Juno 106 came out, there was a patch that sounded like a helicopter. Now, that's great. How much use am I going to get out of that? You know,
Maybe once.
maybe, but yeah, I see your point. You know, it's the stuff that's more accessible is the stuff that's what they're looking for.
Most musicians, I mean, the old story is most of the Prophet Fives that came back to the factory came back with the factory sounds. And it's true for a lot of instruments that DX7s as well. You know, synthesists, and we as synthesists, we look back on it and we're just like, sure, of course we make our own sounds. Sure we know what we're doing. But the average guy who may be playing a wedding gig or maybe doing music scores, that doesn't mean that he all of a sudden becomes a synthesist.
He's also looking for something quick.
Yeah, he wants to fill a niche. He has a need.
Exactly.
And
And by the way, nobody wanted to program a DX7.
no,
Okay, I'm sorry, but
except Manny Fernandez.
okay, maybe.
And he's an expert at it. And he has my complete admiration.
Where'd my water go? There we go.
But we take it for granted that people, well, we're a very small niche of synth nerds.
Yes.
And we take it for granted that, of course, people are doing their own editing. But the numbers, it's like a pyramid,
I would say so. I would guess that, the vast majority of people are preset people.
Yeah, and that's great for me because it was great at the time because I made a living. I was working a lot of hours and thousands of sounds. People ask me, do you remember the sounds that you made for that synth? And I'm like, I don't have any idea.
Remember what I ate for breakfast?
It was, one after the other.
Of course.
And the thing that was interesting is, after a while, you realized, okay, I'm going to make. It was almost like making a buffet, of being a cook. I need some meat, I need some potatoes, I need some vegetables.
Right.
They needed to fit into certain categories, and I actually I'm giving a talk on Sunday. I actually came up with about 10 categories that I felt really filled most of the niches, 90% of what the types of sounds, the categories of sounds that people would need.
Interesting.
And there's wide variation.
Of course.
Just like you say, you can make a vegetable casserole. You can make.
There's strings and there's strings. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Sure.
And I found that it obviously worked because I kept getting hired. And I also was open to criticism. I was working for people like Eric Pershing, and he's not going to take crap.
I was going to say, Eric is definitely going to be one of the more demanding clients, with good reason. Yeah.
He's one of the best there ever was,
Yeah.
or ever is, still.
Yes. Well, I always used to remember, when you would pick up one of the new Roland modules, they had the little demo tune, and you would play that, and then you'd get it home and you'd realize there is no way in hell that I'm going to get all of those sounds out of this module, because that man is, beyond reproach.
He's not only an incredible sound designer, but he's a great musician, a great composer.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the whole package.
And just a really nice human being, too.
Yes,
He really
a great
is.
guy. But he was very not tough, but just direct. He said, these sounds have too much chorus. They have too much delay. They're too wet.
Well, but that's good, though, if he gave you real usable criticism like that, as opposed to, I don't like it.
No, and that made it easy to fix them.
Exactly. If a client knows what they want, that's...
Tell me what you don't like.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll fix it, no problem.
Yeah.
And usually it was only one round of revisions. And it wasn't all the sounds. He would go through them, and usually I would get hired to do 50 sounds at a time, sometimes 100, sometimes more, but usually between 50 and 100. And a lot of times they would just take them as they were and say, these are great, thank you. And, next time, in fact, for Roland, they would send me a JV 1080 or a 2080. We've got a new expansion board. I'd get an email or I'd get a note or a call saying, we've got a new sound card. We need 50 sounds. They'd send me the module. I'd do the sounds with the card in it, and I'd ship the module back to Japan. And they'd send it back to me with the next one. And I'd ship it back. As you know, because they had a unit, and I think the board was a prototype. So they didn't, I had a 2080, and they said, no, we don't want you to put it in yours. Just take the module as it is. And you know, I don't remember how many boards that, it must have been like a dozen boards that came and went. The other instrument, or the one instrument that really I fell in love with, was when the K2500 came out, when they took the 2000 and put it in the...
That was a whole other level.
The vast synthesis was just, and still to this day, to a large degree, is unmatched in terms of the DSP and the variations that you can create with it.
I mean, Kurzweil's always been in a class by itself in that sense.
And their sampling technology was just brilliant. I mean, they had created a bunch of really serious proprietary tools for taking noise out. And so the quality of what you got in terms of the raw samples, it wasn't as extensive as like Korg or Roland, but the richness of the sound, somehow they just captured a depth of in the sounds and in the samples that really gave you wide berth to manipulate them in different ways and turn them into something different.
So, based on the premise that so many people are preset people, was it interesting to you to hear your sounds in songs? Could you identify, oh, that's 67?
Not that often. There's a few sounds that I did that were somewhat iconic. The Prophecy was the other instrument that probably was one of the things I'm most proud of everything that I've done, for a couple of reasons. I got involved very early. Korg brought me to Japan as part of the team, along with a guy named Peter Schwartz, who's an incredible programmer, musician, musical director, a guy from Korg UK, and the Japanese team. And the three of us really created a lot of the patches for that at Korg Japan. And it was the first time one of my sounds got chosen as the first patch, which was called Prophetic Steps. And that was really cool. That was really a highlight. The machine.
So you hear that, folks? Go look for that.
They just released a VST version of it that's phenomenal. And actually, the talk I'm giving on Sunday, I'm going to be using that tool quite a bit, because looking at it as the VST, it was so far ahead of its time, even by today's standards, that we didn't know what we even had. The building blocks that were in there and the amount of modulation and different oscillator types in the physical modeling, you had a little display. We just didn't know how much was underneath there that we could actually access.
I mean, I'm betting that a lot of the best patches are happy accidents.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, you can't intentionally go in and say, I'm going to do this, because there's so many variables there that you're going to end up way over here from where you thought you were navigating. And that's part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest tips that I could give somebody who's making their own sounds is save them often and save versions.
Yep.
Nord actually did something on their A1 synth, which I don't know if they still make. They had a like button, and you could, when you got to a point and you like the sound, you hit the like button and it saved a version of it. And you could step back, because there's a point when you're doing sounds where you'll hit a really sweet spot. And then you'll say, well, maybe if I do this or I do that, and you go off.
And you end up over in Cleveland. Yeah.
And you're too far from Chicago to Cleveland, and you can't get back. And you're like,
damn it, why didn't I save that?
So I've learned over the years that save it, give it a name, and then save it again when you hit another sweet spot, add a suffix A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, whatever.
Yeah.
Use a simple name and save it often, because eventually you're going to overwork something. Just like with music, you know,
Sure, of course.
you lose the inspiration and something gets lost.
Yeah.
The other thing is, of course, the thing crashes and you're right in the middle of the sweet spot, and
Oh, never.
sound just there's
Yeah.
been times where whole banks of sounds have gone to data heaven, and there's just a sinking feeling of like, oh my God, there's just dozens of hours of work.
Oh yeah, yeah. I had 4 songs for a session, all programmed in, all the MIDI files, everything, and it crashed the night before the session. I know of what you speak. Yes.
It's a lot of people, I'm sure,
Yeah,
have
we've all been through
experienced
that,
it,
yeah.
and it's just the worst feeling in the world.
Yeah. It's a rite of passage, though.
You learn by
Screwing
being
up.
burned.
Yep.
So, and even with software synths,
Oh yeah.
same thing is true. I was working on the Prophecy, an early version of the software, and I kept saving it because it would crash, which was expected. I mean, it's the prototype. It's still not. It's not a shippable. It's not QA'd. It's not fully functional. It's not a shippable product. So saving sounds is, and I've also is really important. And I also learned something fairly recently. If you put a number 1 in front of each of the sounds you create, they'll show up at the beginning of the list of all the patches. And that makes it really easy to find your sounds,
Yeah.
because I've learned I don't remember. I don't remember the name, and sometimes I'll spell it a certain way, and I'll use a phonetic kind of a spelling, you know, school, S-K-O-O-L instead of school, whatever. And I can't remember what the name was. I can't find it. You know, sometimes you have hundreds of patches, and it's like, what did I call that patch?
Well, and I also think the naming of patches is an art form in itself, you know? I mean, I know some companies have different people making the patches and naming them because, you know,
I've come up with made-up words.
Yeah.
I just make up words. I can't. It's actually a lot like the drug industry. Like we've got Xanarex and we've got Technical, and it's like
ask your doctor if CZ101 is right for you.
right. It's like where do they come up with these names for the drugs? They're nonsensical, but there's a whole art form and a whole etymology to letters and how people respond to them and what they elicit in the mind. But you try to come up with some name that's going to be somewhat descriptive. But sometimes you just come up with something that
Sometimes it's completely in left field.
it doesn't matter if the sound is not based in reality.
Who cares? Yeah.
What is the name going to tell you? You got to listen to it.
Here's my patch, Fred. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Fred,
Or in
Fred
your
and
case,
Wilma.
in your case, it would be one Fred and
One Fred,
Wilma. Yes.
one Fred A, one Fred B, one
Nice.
Fred C, and then maybe I'd go to Wilma, and Betty and Barney.
Of course.
I'm dating myself, and I've lost my train of thought.
That's okay, because I want to redirect you anyway.
Okay.
I want to know, I know you left the industry for a while and you recently got back in.
Yes.
So was the motivation just that you missed it? You wanted to have fun again, or?
The motivation was, that's actually a large part of it, yes. In 2002, I literally just walked away for a number of reasons. I started to get some tinnitus. I was getting burnt out. And the third reason was I saw a Cubase VST. And that was like looking at the future and seeing VST going like this and seeing manufacturing going like that, hardware.
Yes.
You know, it was
Yes.
it was prescient that was where things were going to go, because there were some good things that were happening early on, and my stock and trade was based on hardware.
On hardware.
And I knew that once it became software, the value of the work would be less. And I had created a piece of software that I had published, and life changes, and I just decided it was time to make a wholesale change, and I went into project management, which I still do. I've been doing it for 20 years, maybe more.
But yet,
And then,
but like everybody else in the music industry, they keep
sucks you
pulling
back
in. Yes.
well, actually putting out this album, the CD with David Torn, was the start of it. And that got some interest, and I was like, okay, maybe there's something here. I had never stopped paying attention to what was going on in the industry.
Sure.
I followed all the releases of all the instruments and the trends, and watched dance music. And if you ever told me that people were going to be using huge modular systems and you'd be using Buchla gear, again, I mean, when at that time, they didn't exist. They were unobtainium. I mean, unobtainium. Somebody had a Buchla music easel. It was like a VCS3 was rare, but a Buchla. So, what we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years, the evolution and the explosion, and everybody and their grandmother and their dog have a synthesizer.
Yes.
I mean, it's just become so prevalent. And I thought, well, you know what? Why not I get back in? I have some years of experience and see where it goes. I did keep working over those years with two companies, G-Force and Dave Spears, who I knew from back in days when he was with General Music, and Sound Toys, because a lot of the work that I did was not synths, was not only synths, was effects devices. I did a lot of reverb design. And actually the two most well-known things that I've ever done are crystal echoes for the original H3000, which became Shimmer, and took on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And the black hole reverb for the DSP 4000.
Oh, wow.
So those are probably the two. It's interesting. Two effects were the two most impactful designs that I did, or patches that I did in music. And when you say, "Can I hear it?" I hear them all
Everywhere.
I was watching Top Gun Maverick on the way over on the flight, and there's an incredible score. Was it Top Gun? No, it was actually Skyfall, 007. And Thomas Newman did an incredible score for it. And I hear crystal echoes or shimmer in one of the quieter passages, and I'm saying,
Oh,
well,
it's
that's
ubiquitous. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's become ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And it was when you said happy accident, it was just a happy accident. It's just a reverse shifter with a certain amount of delay, tuned to a fifth, just to the point where it glistens but doesn't go into runaway. But it hadn't been done. It was available. It's sort of like, people talk about music. That song's just waiting for somebody to do it. It's out there in the ether, and somebody's going to write that song. It was just a patch that, if it wasn't me, somebody else would have figured it out. But I just happened to stumble upon it, and they ended up putting it in the H3000, and they said, help sell thousands of units. Guitarists went nuts over it.
Too bad you can't get a royalty every time someone
No,
uses the patch,
that was when you're doing piecework, pay per patch.
I know it well.
There are times when I've looked back and said, boy, I wish I would have held on to that one. Or said, you know what, this one I think is going to have some legs. Let's talk about a different kind of a deal. But I still feel I'm proud of it. Still feel a sense of satisfaction from having done something that I know inspired people and people used in their music. You want to think that when you do something that it's going to be useful. I mean, really, that's patch creation, what it's about. It's like you want to create sounds that are going to inspire people to make music and that they're going to enjoy using.
That's it exactly.
So it's an art form.
It is. And I think that's the point, is you're creating something that will inspire others. And that in itself, I think, puts you in a unique position as a sound designer.
You have to you have to put yourself in the position in an extrapolated way of composers, and also listening to what's happening in trends. I still make keyboard-oriented sounds, and there are guys who make dance sounds and techno sounds so far beyond me, and the whole grid and sequence stuff.
Yeah.
That's not my thing, and there's a whole generation of people who have grown up doing that, and they've got that under their skin. So I consider myself more classical in terms of my sound design approach. I'm still creating sounds that are interesting, but they're still keyboard oriented, because I'm a keyboard player and I'm an organ. So even my how much velocity I use and how much expression I use, I'm not coming from a pianist's point of view.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and that's why there's plenty of people doing it.
Absolutely. So for you, you came back into this. Somebody getting into it now, younger person, what would you advise them?
What would I try to find a niche that you're good at, and make it. Notoriety has a negative connotation. Get your accolades for doing something that is unique and useful, and try to differentiate yourself. But these days, I mean, there are so many patch libraries and so many sample libraries out there. It's like almost everything you'd want is somewhere to be found. The trick is, how do you find it? But if I was going to say I want to be a sound designer, try to make some patches that you think are really good. Contact some of the manufacturers. Say, I'd like to send you some patches that I've done. I'm interested in what you do. It's like almost any other industry. You sell yourself, but make sure you have a good product, and you're positive, and you're putting your best foot forward, and hopefully your work speaks for yourself. And just be professional. That's the other thing. Deliver on time.
Yeah.
Do your quality assurance. Make sure the sounds are even. Don't leave loose threads. So be clean, be professional, and try to come up with something that sounds inspiring.
Good advice.
It's how it worked for me. I think it's just basic truisms.
Yeah. Drew Schlesinger, thank you for being my guest.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.